Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us at Getting What You Measure, Incentives for Collaboration. My name is Amy Dockser Marcus. I am a staff reporter at the Wall Street Journal, where I write frequently about collaboration. And in fact, often, though, end up writing about why collaborations often don't go as expected. That tends to be the theme of many stories. And we have some experts on this panel today who I think will be able to answer questions both about why collaboration is so difficult and also what sorts of incentives we could give or changes we could make in the culture that would allow more collaborations to flourish. I'm going to just briefly tell you who everyone is. We'll start, talking, and then later in this conversation, I will open it up for questions so that you can also speak with our panelists. I will start on my far left, Carrie. She is Acting Chief of Staff and Associate Director for Science Policy at the National Institutes of Health. Then Dan, who is Director of Innovative Technology Solutions at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Carolyn, Vice President, Discovery and Partnership with Academia at GSK. And then on my right, Robi, President of CHDI Foundation. And last but not least, Gigi, Executive Director, MIT Center for Biomedical Innovation. And our panel reflects the diversity also of collaboration with government, corporations, foundations. We have it all. Robi, I think I'm going to start with you. And although I'd like everybody on the panel to feel free to jump in, could you first talk about, in your experience, what are some of the key challenges that you faced in your role in first developing collaborations and also ensuring that they will be meaningful collaborations?
So at CHDI, we're a private foundation that works on Huntington's disease, which is a pretty rare disease. And within that field, we're the big gorilla, and we fund quite a bit of the work, which sort of gives us the opportunity to try experiments to see what works and what doesn't work. And I think one of the things we've learned over the last few years is that you have to have a broad concept of collaboration. It isn't just like bringing two people to work together, but it's bringing everybody necessary to the table to solve a problem. And that's, in neuroscience like Huntington's disease, that's a problem that's going to be solved in many parts over a long period of time, so it's very dynamic. And I think the key to making something like that work is to always be thinking about what the incentives of the various people are that you're trying to get involved in the project. And very often people go into this and they're thinking about what they want themselves and not what the other people want. And if you start by doing a really deep think about what the other people want, it gives you ideas about how to bring them together. So like that's one half of it. And the other half is that once you figure out what they want, which is, basically is to participate in rewarding work and get recognition and the usual Maslow's hierarchy kinds of things. Making that happen is hard. You don't just say, let's just work together, kumbaya, it'll be great, we'll all produce something, or we'll all be on the paper, we'll all be on this. The fact is people have different interests, and it's making sure those different interests are both respected but also actualized. So one of the things at CHDI we do is we have agreements that as someone comes in, we anticipate that they're going to be collaborative. That means they're going to share their stuff. Not necessarily today, but it will be available if someone in the future needs it. Likewise, just saying it's available to be shared isn't enough if people can't get it easily, because we're sort of trying to always reduce the barriers to people sort of participating in one of these groups. So we create materials repositories, data repositories. We have meetings where we go out of our way to introduce the right people to each other so they can work together. So it's kind of I guess the bottom line is it's an actively managed process. And if you just think it'll happen because everyone's well motivated, it won't. So I'm not a scientist, I'm running a scientific enterprise, but I think management is an important part of making that happen and should not be discounted.
I think that's a really interesting and important point that you raise about trying to figure out what the different parties in a potential collaboration want to get out of it. And I think, Carolyn, one of the things I was curious about with the collaborations that you work on is, I sometimes think that when industry partners with academics, that actually the two sides want different things. Because for an academic, the coin of the realm often is publication. That's very, very important for an academic. And for someone who is in a company, the coin of the realm often is coin. I mean, you need to develop a profitable drug, and you don't want to wait for the timetable of publication. You need to start going. So how do you bridge the gap in the collaborations that you're trying to foster when inherently the groups come in with different desires and incentives?
So that leads me really well from what Robi just said. I think the way I see it is, first of all, you absolutely need that common goal. It's not just that the academic might want publications or we might want something else. We need a common goal that needs to be at the core of the agreements to begin with. So for end-to-end DPAC collaborations, so within my group, the end goal is towards a medicine. We won't engage with each other unless that's our mutual end goal. Now, along the way, we both will have other things that we will want out of that collaboration, such as publications. So we build that into our collaboration agreement to make sure that as we're generating tools, getting towards, for example, a molecule that you can take into the clinic, that you can publish on those tools, recognizing how critical that is. Another real need is the funding. And we talk about that often, but we have a model where in the preclinical phase, it's inflection point driven. So we're paying ahead of the next inflection point to facilitate that work being done within the academic. And then it switches to a milestone agreement as we progress through the clinic. So it's really recognizing the needs of each other. I would say the other thing that I think is really critical to a successful collaboration is that both partners are contributing to that collaboration. It's not just us handing over a compound and saying, oh, please test our compound in your model and then come back to us with the data. That's much too handing it over the fence. What we really need is a partnership where we bring a certain expertise to the table. And often for pharma, that will be high throughput screening, chemistry, safety, and then clinical trials. For the academic, bringing the biology, or often bringing that access to the patient samples, or bringing that access to patient insight. Absolutely critical for us to bring things forwards into the clinic. So I think that's another key aspect.
You mentioned also how funding can be an important tool for being an incentive in collaboration. And I did want to ask both Dan and Carrie, you both are funders, and I think that that's obviously a way to incentivize. But sometimes money isn't enough. So, if you give a grant to someone and you feel that they're not collaborating in the way that you were hoping for, what's your recourse? Do you need to wait for the grant to run out and then you just quietly never give them more money? or do you jump in, in the middle and say, hey, we gave you this money, and while we don't necessarily expect you to, come up with the final product immediately, we do expect you at least to work well. So I was hoping that both of you could, talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, this is going to sound like a very bureaucratic and sort of process-oriented answer, but I'm from the government, so maybe that's appropriate. So I think it gets back in many ways to this concept of an actively managed relationship. And from our point of view as a funder, that needs to begin in terms of the inception of the solicitation. So we need to make sure that if we are looking to foster collaboration between whatever we see as the important parties to moving that research priority forward, we need to make sure that baked into the way we're soliciting grant applications makes it very clear what we expect as sort of the metrics of that collaboration, and that in stating that up front, it becomes part of the term and conditions of the award. And so when people take that money, they know up front it's coming with those strings attached. I think the hardest problem to solve is at times when we have sort of this, maybe some ambiguous statements about we encourage, collaboration, and we, encourage you to seek out partners, but we're not very specific in what exactly that means. We're not saying that means we expect you to share data. That means we expect that this will be the approximate makeup of your steering group, for example, or project management group. And if we are not specific at the onset and the solicitation of the research, it is much harder for us to have sort of a trigger when something is not going right. And so that gets into thinking, I think, very thoughtfully from the beginning, what are you trying to get out of that collaboration? What are the shared goals that you are trying to get to? Because I think it's not the collaboration itself you're trying to achieve. The collaboration is a means to the ends. What is the needle that you're trying to move forward in terms of the research?
Okay. And Dan, what about from your perspective, especially I think as a private funder, one might even argue, I'm not about shared goals, I'm about my goals. We're writing the checks and we're writing them for a specific reason. So how do you see that from a funder perspective?
Yes, I think that's a very important issue. I originally come from NIH, so I don't want to throw NIH too much under the bus here, nor even the Gates Foundation. But there was a model at DARPA that I was very intrigued by, and I'll start it with a very provocative statement, and that is, how many NIH R01s are actually cut for performance? How many are actually actively managed? My guess is the answer is 0. I will go to the Gates Foundation and ask, how many grants do you cease and desist? You may be collaborative, you may agree on endpoints, but things are not going well. These are difficult problems that we're trying to solve. How many do we stop and reconvene or recreate new teams to solve the problem? The answer is very low. And so I think your statement is very important. Whether you're a disease foundation, a patient advocacy group, or the Gates Foundation representing the needs of the poor, you have a vested interest and you're responsible to them. And so I do think that needs to be first. And if the problems that we're solving are very difficult, then we probably not, and particularly if we're taking a really high risk opportunity, there's going to be a non-success rate, and the sooner you can get out of it, the better. And at DARPA, that model, most of the investments that I had made, I think we had about 85% cut rate during the period of performance, whether it was an academic or industry partner, where we stopped the investment because the progress was not proceeding.
So you just pulled the plug right there in the middle.
Well, yeah, communication's key, but yes, that should be part of the relationship if you're going to take on a high risk. And I think biomedical space is an inherently a high risk endeavor.
Yeah.
What proportion of that is sort of pulling the plug for scientific failure, which happens more than 85% of the time? Absolutely. But what about sort of cultural misbehavior? Like people who don't share stuff, or versus waiting to the end, say, okay, like you're out, we won't do that with you again. Like, do you ever get to a point where you actually fight with someone to get data out of them, or things like that?
Well, so yes, I think that happens all the time. Luckily, I've been on the side where it's non-dilutive capital on my side, so I have a tool, which is the funding to get the data out of it. These are difficult things. Obviously, you need to communicate up front that if you're going to take a high chance that we need to cease and desist. Sometimes even with technical success. I think I can name the company. I won't talk about the project, but I worked with GE on investment at DARPA, and they performed technically all of their goals. We also funded 3 other groups, and one of those other groups had a more ambitious project that seemed to have more value to us. So even though they met all of the requirements of the relationship, we stopped the investment because we wanted to put our money on the more ambitious opportunity. And that was written into the relationship from the beginning. On a personal level, I'm sure there were some people with, hurt feelings and discomfort, but organizationally and operationally, it worked out. Like GE came on and for other grants. It's not like we ruined the relationship at an organizational level. But sometimes I think that ruthless focus on the goal is necessary, even when we're forming teams. Unforming teams is just as important.
Dan, you're raising some great points about culture and how important that is, and I wanted to ask Gigi about that especially, because I think that is one of your focuses is, how can we make a dramatic cultural shift? Collaboration is, especially at a conference like this, where people gravitate towards this conference because they believe in this idea of collaboration. It is a great word, but humans, it's hard to change behavior. We all know that. So what kind of work are you doing to help change behavior?
Yeah. So first, let me just set the context for what we're doing in the MIT New DIGS program, which is my primary focus. New DIGS is a global multi-stakeholder collaboration. It stands for New Drug Development Paradigms. It's a kind of funky acronym for that. And I would say that our work, we make an assumption that you guys are going to figure all these problems out, and that there's going to be some tremendous scientific breakthroughs, which are already coming out. Curative therapies, all kinds of really exciting things. Our goal is to make sure that the patients actually benefit from these in timely ways. And I think that in many ways, the downstream part of the value chain is somewhat neglected in terms of innovation. And that's what we're focused on. So in particular, I think what's driving a lot of the collaboration in New DIGS is that, it used to be the case with new drugs that just getting regulatory approval was pretty much the goal, and then you were pretty much all set, and that's not true anymore, right? And so now we have to start really paying attention to value, demonstrating value, and value is defined very differently, sometimes by payers, by patients, and by providers. So we have to actually figure out a different way of innovating now, because we've got to get that into our thinking, into the planning, much, much earlier in the life cycle. That requires a different kind of collaboration in terms of process innovation, and that's what we're focusing on. It's very challenging to do, but I think it's very important. And in terms of what the shared mission is here, I think in innovation in general, every stakeholder that makes a critical go, no go decision along this value chain has a pretty clear set of incentives and metrics that are operative within their silo. But there can often be conflicts between them. They can be counterproductive. There's no coordination. What we try to do in our work, we're experimenting with how you do this, is to introduce a new metric, which is patient centricity. There's a lot of talk about patient-centric innovation, but we don't really measure our performance as an ecosystem as it relates to patient centricity. So we are doing a lot of work using modeling and simulation, interactive modeling and simulation among the different stakeholders, having patients and caregivers define patient centricity metrics that are meaningful for that disease, for that product. And actually you can see that if you start to make metrics clearly defined, make them visible to everyone, it actually changes how decisions and actions unfold in that room. This is a safe haven environment. The stakes are pretty high in this industry, highly regulated. So our safe haven makes the stakes very small so that we can all play together. It's like an incubator environment. But we think you have to crawl before you walk. But actually putting some teeth in the concept of patient centricity is a game changer. And I think we need to be focusing more on that as well.
When you say teeth, you mean that the patients get to define what success is?
I think patients and caregivers certainly do define a lot of the dimensions of it, maybe not exclusively, but what I mean by teeth is that you can begin to see that In our work, we use actual products that are proprietary products being developed in the industry, and we'll have a room of 40 to 60 multiple stakeholder perspectives in that room and look at this product under non-disclosure. And you can, by teeth, what I mean is that if somebody makes a decision that for them hits a home run with their own incentive system in their silo, but they just shut down the development of a product that a patient group desperately needs, in a sense, they get it's like a wargaming exercise. You see the dashboard figures change. The patient, that wasn't patient-centric. Can we go back and try another what-if scenario where we share risk and uncertainty in different ways that allow for that product to get to a high-risk population? And again, these are scenarios, modeling and simulation. It's all in silico, no commitments, nobody's losing any money. We're just learning together about different ways of operating.
That's interesting. Robi, I was thinking about something that Dan said, and I was wondering if you could give a perspective on that as well. When you are working to find cures for a rare disease, often there's only a very small group of scientists and researchers who are working on it and are even interested in doing it. If you penalize them too much for bad behavior, you may lose your intellectual firepower, and then you're stuck. Who's going to work on this? And there are even rarer diseases than Huntington's disease. So if you could sort of extrapolate out from that, but how much can you push people to change behavior if you're dependent on them in some way to try to solve this terrible disease?
Well, a couple of these. First of all, it sounds like Stockholm Syndrome. And I think you have to get up in the morning with the attitude that no single person or small group of people can hold up the mission you're trying to achieve. Because if you start to think like that, it's a slippery slope down to like funding bad work and having low standards and stuff like that. But I'd also say that one of the drivers of collaboration is, and I didn't know anything about Huntington's when I started doing this, was that it started with kind of like a closed community, like the people who were prepared to work on it. And in fact, that was bad, because it sort of became groupthink, and there was no creativity and saying how. And even from my point of view, people would propose experiments. I'd say, really? Like, why are you doing it in that order? Or like, why don't you? Now, sometimes there's great answers for this. Or you say, well, or why don't you do it 3 times as much, right? Because you'll get it faster. And if time is one of our things, you could redesign it. And people go, oh, I never thought of that. So I think I don't think it's the case that you're dependent on, very specific domain expertise that other people can't pick up or can't contribute to. And over the course of the last 15 years, the community's expanded hugely, and we probably support now 800 FTEs around the world, and it's people like IBM. If you just think how the science has developed over the time, by necessity, you got to bring new people in. The big data people we're talking about, so the genetics stuff. So, and the last thing I'd say is, you don't want it to be adversarial. Like, we're not hitting people hard. I think it's a question of, at the beginning, creating common expectations. And the fact that people have different interests is actually a potential joint gain. So like publications, they want to publish. We say, of course, you should publish, okay? But we say the time issue, like we don't want to wait for your publication to be able to tell other people who are working on things that we know this is relevant to. So we do everything by agreement. Our agreements allow us to disclose those findings to other people as long as they agree to keep it confidential. It's kind of like Gordon conference rules, and it's kind of, if you could explain it to people in a way that they understand, or take your time and explain it properly, 80% of the people accept this and think, oh, that's a good idea. You have to be careful not to fall into the squeaky wheel trap. There's always, the world's 80-20. 20% of the people are not going to get it initially. They're going to fight you. Don't work with them. Okay, the other 80% want to be part of your collaboration. Work with them, and in my experience, the others eventually come along. They see this thing happening. They figure out you have to help them save face and come in, and it's great. But it's got to be like a win-win, always a win-win kind of thing.
And I think that the very reason why people have positive feelings and are very motivated to try to improve collaboration is the recognition of the fact that no one segment of the ecosystem is an island, that this idea that there's a small, expert community or extraordinary individuals is not enough, they're not bringing the full package to the table. And in fact, to get that full package, you need to be able to collaborate and bring new blood or new partners or different ideas to the mix.
Okay, so when you have to be, unfortunately, these things are hard and take a long time. And you have to recognize that some people are going to feel, oh, I labored on this for 20 years. And then, these new hotshots came in and solved the problem and are going to get all the glory. You have to anticipate that and work against that also, and make sure that everybody gets proper acknowledgement for their contributions, and that they can see, that's a fear people have before it happens. So you got to address it before it happens also, to keep them productive and engaged in the effort.
How do you ensure that everybody gets proper acknowledgement from you perhaps? You could properly acknowledge them, but then it goes into the outside world, and reporters like myself quote certain people and don't quote others, and so they feel slighted. Or your boss doesn't recognize you, or you don't get first author. People have different preferences for the way they want to be acknowledged. So how do you, it's a lot of people with a lot of needs. How do you address everyone's individual special need?
I didn't say it was easy. Okay, but you have to recognize that that's kind of that's part of the job to make one of these big community collaborations work.
Is to figure out what might make everybody feel good at least a little bit.
It's an optimization problem.
Yeah. Carrie, I'd like to hear a little bit more from you, because one of the things I think about is that of all the players on the field, I feel like NIH has the biggest carrot and the biggest stick. And I often feel that they're really good at using the carrot, but they often don't want to use the stick. And they have ways to do it. There are laws that you could insist be enforced, and sometimes it feels like they're not enforced for a variety of reasons. There are even ways to say to people, next time you apply for a grant, we're going to check and see if you deposited all the data that you said you were going to deposit, and if we see you haven't, you're going to get knocked off in the scoring, and it's going to make it a lot harder to get your next one. What is NIH's feeling with getting tougher and using that big stick more often?
Yeah, well, certainly, and it should be noted that it's a very big stick, because I think sometimes people recognize that less than ideal behavior is happening on an individual level with, particular investigators or particular projects. But from our perspective, our grantees, of course, are the institutions. And so when we take action on a grantee, it's the institution which could have perhaps far greater effects. And we're always cognizant of that. Now, that being said, I think that you have seen some of a shift in terms of our willingness to use that, certainly in the data sharing world. The recent clinical trials registration and reporting rule and subsequent NIH policy is very much focused at the institution level, is a big stick, and we are putting in place systems where if you're not reporting the results of your clinical trial, there are going to be serious consequences in terms of your ability to secure additional funding for clinical research. And so we are beginning to use that in a judicious way far more often. I will say also, though, that sometimes the stick is a very much behind the scenes approach, in the sense that our extramural research office spends a lot of time actively managing improvements on more of an individual basis, to make sure that as we're paying attention to the types of behavior we want to incentivize, if we see that things are going awry, we have a lot of conversations with our institutions in a very sort of active way. And sometimes that's very effective, sometimes it's less effective, but it's something that we are giving a lot of thought to.
Yeah. Can I ask ask a follow-up question? Of
course.
I'd be curious to know, so you go back and forth between the investigator and the institution. So is your stick to the institution or to the investigator?
So the stick is to the institution, but certainly the investigators are very cognizant. I mean, in the case of both the institution and the investigator, a lot of the power of that conversation is the recognition of the fact that we are the source of funding, and the investigators are dependent on that funding to be able to answer the research questions. Institutions to carry out their sort of research priorities in the institution are dependent and cognizant of the fact that it impacts a much larger portfolio of work. And so we interact at sort of both those levels, at the level of the investigator and the institution. But our actions tend to be at the level of the institution because they are our actual grantees from a purely legal standpoint.
Yeah. I think, Carrie, you raised the idea also of this notion that a lot of conversations happen behind the scenes. And Carolyn, I think that it's the whole idea of behind the scenes conversations might, I think, worry a lot of people in the public when it comes to pharmaceutical companies and academic investigators. I think that there's, a feeling, a concern that maybe academic investigators might feel that they need to mute criticism. They're concerned that they might jeopardize an important relationship with a pharmaceutical company, or even just the softer ways that people, sometimes mute their criticism because they either like someone or they're used to working with them. How do you address that tension to ensure also that the public respects kind of the output and doesn't think there's something behind the scenes that they're not aware of that's going on?
So that's a really interesting question, and that's why I sort of asked your question. So I'm going to just take a quick step back, because for our agreements, we have very detailed work plans that we draft ahead of time. Now, science changes all the time, so we recognize that. But to hit each one of our inflection points, we have a set of criteria that we outline right at the beginning, and it very much helps us set expectations. It helps us actually to stop collaborations. If we can't meet certain specific criteria, let's say, to go into the next phase, I need a selective compound with this selectivity, this potency, blah, 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 blah. If I can't meet that, then it gives you a stopping point where both parties can leave with, there's no face lost in that. The science didn't work out. And that's okay. It's not that people didn't try. In terms of the other aspects, so for example, again, GSK, we have to have lab notebooks. They have to look like our lab notebooks, et cetera, all the regulations. We have to stick to our internal standards with our academics. That's a bit of an eye-opening thing to many academics. But again, we do behave as integrated teams. We meet on a monthly basis, we visit each other. It very much is an integrated partnership, and I think that's how that aspect works. Yeah. So because it's so open, both in terms of people participating at the Academics Institute as well as within GSK, the team keeps growing to the point that someone else made. The team changes as you progress preclinical into the clinic. It keeps changing membership, et cetera, but the concept is the same. The team changes somewhat over time, but that trust is there, and we haven't run into that problem, actually, of feeling that there's an undercurrent that we haven't shared. We're meeting all the time. We share all the data.
And I think it's also, we've talked about this, and I'm interested in how each of you measure this, but maybe, Dan, I'll start with you, is how do you define a successful collaboration? Is it that, okay, we tried something, even if it didn't work, we put in a good faith effort? Is it that the partnership was successful, and so we'll work again with them? How do you define that this is successful and money well spent?
So, in my case, we're trying to make products, but we don't stay, particularly on the innovation investments, we're not there to see something registered. Many of our endpoints are phase 1 or 2A proof of concept. And so those are very discrete capabilities. I think on the front end, what we want to do is make sure we understand what success looks like before we initiate that, and we've defined that with words that are written down. And particularly on those goals, what really matters for me, because we're not end to end, is that the investment is catalytic. Because I think I'm looking for an experiment, whether it's preclinical or in phase 1 or at 2A, that if I reach that goal, either internally, I will have Gates Foundation partners who will carry that further in clinic, or externally, there will be private sector partnerships, pharmaceutical companies. And so I'm often looking for, because typically I'm making platform investments and forming teams around that. I'm trying to understand what the commercial opportunity is. And it's not necessarily the academic investigator within the pharmaceutical company or the academic in academia. I really want to understand from their business teams, this is a critical inflection point where we now value what the outcome is. And then separately, on our very narrow Gates Foundation goal, because we're often going after very low market opportunities, that we're going to get a inflection point that's technical towards our product that we need. And those two things are often orthogonal, and so we will design our experiments to reach both of those goals. That would be success.
Okay.
And I think it gets back to the fact that collaboration, again, is not the end. Collaboration is the mean to the end. So success, I think, is did you reach that end goal, whatever it is, and with the slight nuance of, do the members of the collaboration have consensus on that point? Do they feel that the goal was met in a way that represents what they were bringing to the table on the front end?
But Robi, your foundation wants to basically find cures for Huntington's disease. Treatments, that's a better word. Treatments even, effective treatments that really mitigate the course of the disease, if not eventually stop it in its tracks. Without that, would you ever call anything you do a success? Any collaboration of any kind success if it doesn't yield a treatment that changes the disease?
Well, from a patient perspective, and I think from our foundation's perspective, the answer is no, right? The only thing that really counts at the end of the day is putting a drug on the shelf in the pharmacy that a patient can take and it makes a difference to them. As a business, that creates a lot of difficulties. I mean, if you just think that, compared to making an app, okay, which you can put out and get feedback on, in 36 hours, this is something that could take 10 or 20 years from the idea to fruition, with lots of things not working. I don't want to call them failures, but you try this, it does work along the way. So in that sense, you always have to think, look, really what counts here is something that makes a difference to patients. Now, on the other hand, you have to motivate the people along the way. So a well-formulated, well-powered, well-executed experiment that does not sustain a hypothesis but rules something out is valuable, right? And you have to make sure people are rewarded, intrinsically, psychically, intrinsically, and in the appropriate circumstances with money, and the way you motivate people to do, because all those things have to be done. And again, like I would give an example. We have a collaboration with 12 years ago, we started funding this company, Ionis. They refer to them today, where they have a great SMA thing. Well, they also have an antisense for Huntington's, which is now in phase 2A. We went to them when they didn't think about neuroscience and said, we have a single gene. Your thing should be good. So let us support you and get going. And over the years, working together with them, we brought in knowledge about Huntington's disease. They said, how are we going to measure it? We said, let's go look around and see if we can find some people to develop an assay to measure it, measure Huntington, which wasn't their thing. So there's kind of achievements along the way which make you think you're on the right direction, okay? But we just had another trial. We had great preclinical work, a collaboration with Pfizer and all kinds of other CROs and people working on a PDE10 inhibitor. We did a well-powered, well-designed phase 2B study. Didn't work, okay? Yeah. But we'll learn something from it. Are we treating too late? There's all kinds of issues that, if you do good work, it moves you forward, even when the immediate achievement is not your big mission of being able to help patients. But again, like to me, that's management, right? You got to think about how do you keep the team going? How do you move people along? How do you get other people willing to help you? But it's hard.
And Gigi, how would you measure success if they enjoy the war game, but they don't apply it in real life, to doing something with it?
So the work that we do, actually looking at individual products as a methodology, it's really about using each product as a lens into how the system is and isn't working right. And our goal in New Digs is to drive system level changes that no single company or no single stakeholder can drive on their own. So ultimately that's the big home run for us. And our first project was kind of astonishing to us, the power of this approach, because we took on, I won't go into a lot of details on it, but some people in the audience might be familiar with, we did a project looking at a new approach to regulatory decision making, an alternative to the binary go, no-go model of a blockbuster kind of approval, something that would be more suitable for the era of personalized medicine, where you can approve a product for a subpopulation of patients at particularly high risk, and then manage the rollout in a more staged way and collect real-world evidence that informs refinement of the label and broader expansion to the broader population. We did this under the name of adaptive licensing. And we were warned by some senior-level government officials when we first looked at this as a possible first project that we were crazy to take it on as a proof of principle for our New Digs approach, because it was going to take 10 to 15 years and $30 billion to move the needle of regulatory decision making, and we decided to do it anyway. After 3 years and $3 million, we did 13 of these case-based analyses that laid the intellectual foundation for the EMA in Europe to decide to move forward with a European-wide pilot program on under the name of adaptive pathways as opposed to adaptive licensing. That pilot project is now complete. There's still a lot of work to do. We all learned a lot from it, but from our point of view, that was astonishing. Given what we were warned about at the front end. I don't know if we can repeat that again, you never really know, but we learned a ton about collaboration on big, hairy, audacious problems that require everybody to be at the table. Everybody has to operate a little bit differently. And we think that in this kind of an environment, you can drive success that is not anything we're used to seeing. This isn't usually how it works, so we're kind of learning as we go.
So I'd like everyone to be at the table here too. So that might be a good moment for questions from the audience. I think the panelists would, welcome an opportunity to delve, more deeply into a couple things. So I see some people have questions. I think they're going to bring are you going to bring the mics forward? Okay. So if you have a question, do you want to come and stand in a line and just at the mic, and to please speak into the mic, because they're going to be recording this, so they want to hear your questions.
Hi, I'm Brian Pollard from Hyperacusis Research. Hyperacusis is a rare ear disorder where everyday sounds creates pain, such as in presence like this. Clinical trial follow-up is a key one for our organization, and one of the things I found is that what is present today is the successes and not the failures. The main way you know a trial didn't succeed is it's a little bit dated and there's no new information. Is there any specific action plan for that?
Well, certainly some of that is going to be captured in terms of the new requirements under the FDA, the CT.gov rule, which will sort of widen the universe of what's captured on clinicaltrials.gov in many ways. We are certainly thinking as an agency more and more about, beyond the sort of more formal sharing of results, thinking about more active management and transparency of our clinical trials system and in terms of funding. So, just to take a step back and air some dirty laundry, a couple of years ago, Congress came to us and asked us a pretty simple question about how many clinical trials are you funding? And we actually were not able to answer that question because we were not actively managing our trials in a way that allowed us, from a central sort of data point of view, to be able to answer that, which seems sort of absurd, quite honestly. And so we are now moving in a direction of an entire stewardship reform effort on our clinical trials portfolio, in which everything from the way we solicit to the way we manage and ultimately report results from clinical trials is going to be far more actively managed. We're putting in criteria for clinical trial design, and all of that will allow us better transparency for things that are success and better transparency for things that are not a success. So, this is something we are paying a lot of attention to.
That sounds great for the future. Would that include retroactive work to follow up on things that have never been closed out properly?
I think ultimately we would like to go in that direction. Right now, the culture shift to go prospectively is a pretty heavy lift. So, but hopefully, we are hoping that this sort of series of reform efforts itself leads to a cultural shift, and that we really see a sea change that would, I think, lend itself to the sort of broader sharing that you're talking about.
Okay, we have some other questions too.
Good afternoon. My name is Ellen Salkeld from the Aplastic Anemia and MDS International Foundation. This topic was touched on a little bit earlier, but I'd like to kind of unpack it a little bit. We have what we think is a very successful collaboration among 6 leading research institutions around the issue of MDS. We are now going into the second phase of gathering funding for this. The initial phase has run out. And people are asking us quite rationally, okay, what has changed since you created this consortium? Now, almost 5 years later, how has the science, where has the science gone? And so we go back to our researchers and we pose this question, and they say, well, the very fact that you have 6 of the leading academic research institutions even collaborating with each other, that's what they see as the major achievement of this 5-year phase. We have something like 7 or 8 open trials, but none of them have really, moved, and the science is kind of fuzzy. So, any advice, input, what have you, as to how to frame this question for potential funders, because this is a really fantastic thing going on, but we don't have a lot to show for it scientifically quite yet.
That's a great question. Glad I don't have to answer that.
So, just simplistically, as you've marched your several compounds into the clinic, so you have a number of things in the clinic, that is sort of an obvious thing to mention and where that'll get to. But also, what has happened along the way? Have tools been created? Has more biology been worked out? Are there publications that you can point to that have revealed new targets? Are there patient-derived data that you've collected through this consortium that will help identify novel targets in the future? There's lots of things along the way that perhaps would be helpful.
So when you started the consortium and you got them together, did you have a discussion about, okay, this has a 5-year time horizon. What do we expect to accomplish in the 5 years? Because then you would have something to measure against, like, did you don't necessarily accomplish all of them, you accomplish other good things. But I really think the problem with after the fact saying, so what did we accomplish, is never going to have a good answer. You should always start out with at least, what's the experiments we're going to do? And then you can say, we said we're going to do these experiments, we did them, these were the results of the experiments. But I'm not sure that's a very good way to, because it puts a value on the consortium for its own sake rather than the consortium is a better way to achieve certain objectives.
The only other thing I agree with that. The only other thing I would add to that is also managing the expectations of your investors. I think it was said multiple times that drug discovery is a really long process. It is a really long process, and 5 years, depending on what your starting point is nothing. 5 years, you're lucky that you have something in the clinic, depending on what you started with.
Okay, thank you.
Is there, you have a question?
I do.
Yeah.
Hi, Marilyn Metcalf. I'm from GSK. And Gigi, I was wondering if you could tell us a little more about the measures of patient centricity that you all are talking about, and if there's anything coming out of the models that organizations can use to help themselves with those measures also.
I think that what we would convey would be more the process, the importance of the process of formalizing metrics for patient centricity and how you might go about doing it for any given project, whether you're inside of a company talking about a matrix team or you're outside in an external innovation environment. Either way, the process of formalizing that, getting the right inputs from patients and caregivers, and socializing that within the system as part of the setup for working together is important. But I mean, they wouldn't be surprising ones to you. I mean, these are going to be things like, time to market and, the outcomes from it. It would be risk. In one case we looked at, we were actually looking at, for example, the traditional way that you approve a product and how much is unknown about that product at that point in time, and how many patients received that product in the face of all those uncertainties in the traditional model of regulatory approval versus a more targeted staged rollout of a product. Looking at that from a patient's point of view in terms of risk, exposure to risk, even if it doesn't yield any adverse events. Those kinds of things, just looking a little bit differently. But the most important message is there are no universal metrics. Right. They have to be tailored to the process by which you engage the patients and caregivers in setting that up and defining that, working with the other stakeholders. That in and of itself is extremely important. And then making those metrics visible to everyone throughout.
Okay, thank you very much.
I think that what the earlier people asking questions wanted to know, and even what you were asking too, is everybody wants a little bit of advice from where they're sitting on how to maybe get to a more successful and meaningful collaboration that would yield something. And you addressed sort of what maybe how other organizations could adapt this. And I think I'd like to hear from each person on the panel in the sort of final minutes that we have together. Like, for instance, Robi, I'm sure lots of patient-driven foundations maybe even come to you for advice on, well, how should we set up this, before we start investing money in creating this? Can you give us some good advice to ensure that we get something meaningful out of all of this, other than, yay, 6 scientists who didn't want to talk to each other now do? So maybe you could give a little advice on how patient-founded or funded groups could get something meaningful, and maybe we could go down and get some, for final advice for everyone so they could go home with a takeaway point.
So I would make 2 quick points. So I've observed, we're very fortunate because we're a private foundation, and I have the benefit of a scientific staff. So these are scientists that work for me. They don't have to get grants. I can manipulate them, to try get them to do things. But they're not conflicted. So when they look at the science, my job is to get them to give me their best judgment of what we should do and not do. A lot of sort of disease foundations that I've seen have SABs, sort of volunteer SABs. The volunteer SABs are typically in the labs that are directly or indirectly getting the grants. And it's a huge conflict. And so if there's a way to find people who will be on your SAB, they don't necessarily have to be right in your space. They just have to be like good scientists who are thoughtful about scientific method in designing experiments. That's really helpful. The other thing I'd say, just to toot our own horn a little bit, is that from time to time, Faster Cures has had smaller workshops on how to actually do some of this stuff, and everybody who comes gives in documents that says, here's MTAs that allow sharing, and here's the language you need in a research agreement that allows sharing. All the CHDI agreements are up in Faster Cures somewhere. If you search CHDI, you'll see all our stuff. There's a cover memo that tries to explain it, and feel free to call me if you have any questions.
Great. Carolyn.
So I think I will also just tag along on that, the importance of the scientists in this. Again, we talked about having common goals and how important that is. We talked about how both sides need to bring expertise to the table. But at the end of the day, and would be true for the foundations too, is your science good? Is your science right? You can't have conflict of interest. You really need expertise, and you need expertise that matches the phase of wherever you are in terms of what you're bringing forwards, whether or not it's the preclinical expertise to know how to do your target validation studies or to identify new compounds, or the clinical expertise, how to do your proof of concept study. But at the end of the day, it's going to the success will rest on how good your science is. And I'm particularly intrigued actually by Gigi, because I think we look at, can I get to clinical proof of concept? Can I really have impact on the patient? How important that is. But it's actually a bigger question. It's the impact on the patient, it's the payers who play a big role, it's that whole community around that patient. And I think that, to me, that's actually a really growing area that probably we have to do even more of. And I would think if you were in a foundation, really paying attention from all the way, the right targets, target validation, all the way to the patient. Am I benefiting the patient? And then the payer and the regulatory piece is critical. There's a lot of planning there.
I mean, if the question is what can a patient advocacy group do in terms of inducing collaborations, I think the most valuable thing you have is the ability to have alacrity. If you got academia represented here, and industry, and NIH, and if today you left this meeting and you said, I want to do something, and I'm going to measure success by the first dollar going towards the first experiment, and you calculated the number of days that it took you to work with academia, NIH, to get NIH to fund something that you care about, or to get a relationship with a pharmaceutical partner, and you counted those days, my guess is it would be very long. And there would be a lot of excitement in those first couple of weeks as the emails are going around, and then 6 months or a year later, you're finally seeing something happen. But if you really have capital from a foundation, you're not limited by many of the rules of engagement that often governments are, or bureaucratic organizations are, such as academia and industry. And so your ability to take small capital and move very, very quickly and use that as an inducement to collaboration, I think can be a very, very powerful, seductive opportunity. And so that temporal factor is an important tool to induce your collaboration.
Great.
I think I would go back to the, beware the feel-good collaboration, where the collaboration becomes the means to the end instead of the outcome. And don't be afraid, if you find yourself at that point, to sort of say, well, this is all very well and good, but really what, we need to shift focus and think about what are the milestones, what are the no-go decision points we need to meet, and restructure the collaboration to make sure that it's actually meeting an end goal and not just sort of feeding in on itself. And I would also say, I think sometimes in thinking about the collaborations, large and small, that I've watched over the years that have been successes versus not success, is don't be afraid to either, I think there's this, don't be afraid to start out with an audacious goal, and there's value in that. But also, if the onset is, okay, this is a really new series of players, they've never even met each other, much less sat at the same table together, think about, are there near-term, low-hanging fruit, easy successes that can help, reinforce the collaboration so that then your next endpoint can be that audacious goal. I think sometimes there is this phenomenon of collapsing under the weight of the collaboration, because even with the best intentions, the expectations maybe are not in keeping with the stage of that particular collaboration.
Yeah. And Gigi, do you want to just have a final word on your concept of thinking big? Because I think that's, we've talked about how we need to change everything in a sense. So
yeah, I think you changed the question on me at the last minute. So, but that's okay. No, I think the science is advancing faster than the system, and the implications of that are profound. Actually, how we help the system catch up with the science so that patients benefit in meaningful ways, in timely ways. And I think it's really important that we assume, and it's a very exciting time with science. There are incredibly exciting things coming through the pipeline. We absolutely have to make sure the patients get them, the right patients get them, and the rest of the stakeholders across the value chain are going to have to work together in some fundamentally different ways. We're going to have to innovate how we innovate. So it's a very important time to, I think, the process innovation around the whole entity of innovation.
Great. So I wanted to thank everybody on the panel. I think that with the kind of innovation and new thinking that they shared with us today, that we're on the step to making really meaningful outcomes for these collaborations. Thank you so much for joining us.